of what's on the screen. And, and all of this is accomplished by way of CSS, just like you're used to. Once again, this isn't introducing a whole lot of new stuff. And I've got this app.css file in here. And really, the React.js framework is not trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes to styling. All the same CSS concepts apply. In this case, I've baked all of the styles into this one CSS file. And if you look down through here, I've got some, the body and some containers and column styles that apply anywhere those occur. But then for the different components, what we've done is we've used a real popular scoping technique in CSS where we've said, well, whenever I create the inbox pane, now let's go back to that pane, the actual element, and look at the inbox pane. There it is. And we said that whenever this gets rendered, I want that containing div to have an ID of inbox-pane. And so for my CSS styles that I want to only apply inside of the inside of that component, I can just prefix them with this #index pane. And then I can put all of those CSS properties inside there. So actually, first of all, I'm not sure if this is difficult for you to see, so I'm going to go ahead and change my theme for you. All right, now that that's a little bit easier to see, we've got that theme changed for you. You can tell that all of the ones that are in inbox pane, and I've given us a comment so we can tell, are scoped to inbox pane. And then here's our next component, conversation pane, and those ones are scoped just as well. So we're just accomplishing this the same exact way we would in a purely static HTML, CSS, JavaScript site, only we're scoping to our components by giving our components a name and then using that as a kind of a containing element in the CSS rules. So that's it for kind of the miscellanea, and we're going to look next at
the component lifecycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, welcome back. We're still in Module 2. Now we're going to look at the component lifecycle. Now you've seen Rami refer to some of these functions inside of the components. You go, is that a magic word? Like, where does that come from? Why do we need it? So he's going to enumerate all the various lifecycle functions that you need to know if you're using React.
Yeah, so every component has a life cycle. There's different functions, different pieces of the component life cycle. You've heard me mention things about states and props. Well, that's all going to be relevant to the lifecycle methods as well. And we're going to get deeper into the state in Module 3 and how we use props as well to move data around from parent to child in our components. But before we get to Module 3, we need to cover the component lifecycle. And if you take a look at my screen right here, you'll notice that we sort of put them into little buckets, right? And you'll notice that a bunch of these functions are actually going to be called in several different places. So the first time that a component gets rendered, the first thing that's going to happen is we're gonna call get default props. Okay, and this is basically going to be default props that go into our render function in the component. All right, and the next thing that gets called is get initial state. So you saw us in the previous piece of this module, we referenced get initial state. This is when it's called during the first render cycle. And then once those two functions are called, the next thing that gets called is component will mount. And this is perhaps the last opportunity for you to change any of the state before it gets rendered to the DOM. All right, and that's exactly what happens next. It's the render function. All right, so once that is done, we have another method called component did mount to say that we did actually mount. So it's an opportunity for you to do some things after the component was already in the DOM or on the screen. So that's what happens when the first time we render something. If a property changes, so let's say that a props is passed down from a parent to a child, and the state of the parent changes, and that value changes, well then the props change, if it was passed through the props mechanism, that change will be propagated to that child component, all right, and that's what's going to trigger the props change in our screen right here, this cycle right here. So component will receive props is the first function that will be called, and you can even tell React not to continue by returning either false or not if you didn't want it to receive these props. But once a component will receive props is called, the next thing that gets called is should component update. All right, and then if that's returned false right there, it won't update at all. And then if you do want to continue updating, well then the function component will update will be called. And these are, in case it wasn't clear earlier, all of these are functions inside our component. So when I do React.create class, I can actually specify component will update as a function in that piece of code and specify what it does myself. All right. So component will update. Once that's called, it'll actually call the render function again. And then when it's done rendering, it'll say component did update. So you can do some further processing if you need to. Now, if the state changes instead, okay, that's going to trigger a different lifecycle. And what that's going to do is it's going to actually go to should component update on my screen right there. And it'll start with should component update. This is the same function that gets called on props change as well. And then it will call component will update. Again, it's the same cycle here as in our props change. And then the rest of it is exactly the same. So this is sort of what happens when data changes. Now, let's say that you want to actually remove a component from the DOM. Well, then when you do remove it, it'll actually call component will unmount so that you can do some last-minute destruction work, or if you wanted to save the data somewhere before the component is removed from the page, you can do that work over there. So that's the general component lifecycle. You'll see us refer to these methods quite a bit in the next module. So we'll be using the component will mount function, the component did mount function a bunch of times. And when we talk about the pure render mixin as well, that's actually going to have an impact on the should component update function. You'll see how that impacts that function right there, so that you can actually sort of skip some of these lifecycle methods if you don't need them. So that pretty much briefly covers the component lifecycle. You'll actually see how it's used, and it'll become a lot clearer as you see how it's being used in our app. You'll be able to modify the lifecycle to fit the needs of your app as well.
Now, there's one thing I wanted to add, and that is that if in looking at these lifecycle functions, it feels like, boy, my component is having to get rendered a lot. This is feeling expensive. I just want to remind you that what it's rendering is the React DOM. It's not the real DOM. It's rendering this React DOM, and that's an extremely cheap process. Very, very fast to completely re-render all of the DOM objects that are inside in memory inside of the React framework. And so we can re-render as much as we want, and then it's going to handle with differentials. It's going to handle updating the real DOM for us, so it's not actually expensive.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that's good for there, and we're going to go ahead and move into Module 3 and keep cranking through this sample application so you can learn React.js. Hey everybody, welcome back to React.js. We're now in Module 3, and this is a little glimpse of our agenda, so we're moving right along here. We looked at, we kind of got an introduction to the framework overall, and then we looked at components. Now we're going to talk about data and state. So this is Module 3, handling data and state with React.js. Very important topic. So maybe we should start off with a definition of what state is.
State is basically a point in time in your application, and it's all the values of the variables at that point in time.
Okay.
Right. So if you think of an application that perhaps is like a word processor, so something that's like editing a document, right? You might have the first state being the document is empty, right? And then some typing goes in. The next state is the document might have changed. There might be some formatting inserted, or some options have been set in your word processor, and essentially that state could be both the data itself and like the data of the state of the application, like perhaps the bold button is pressed or something. And essentially, like state is all the values of the variables in your application at that point in time. You can go from one state to another, right? A good example of a state is actually in video games. You might have different states of the game.
The score.
Right, the sort of score and all that stuff. There's a lot of different things that sort of go into it, and it's the state of the application is pretty much everything at that point.
The way I like to think about it is if we had an application, if it were possible to like not have any memory and not have any data layer, and we were talking directly to a database, then that database is our state.
Yeah.
You know, that those are the current values as they exist right now, and they're saved because they're in our database. But usually when we're working with an application, we have some state that's in memory, it's in application state, it's kind of in process. It's been pulled out of the data or pulled out of a web service. The user is working with it very close to the UI, and then we're usually responsible for sending that state back, storing it somehow, persisting it somehow.
Yeah.
And then when we're talking about React.js and we're at a component level, it even begs the conversation about state all the more, because we're talking about which state belongs in this component, because these components are kind of responsible for their own state.
Yeah, so the state in React is actually encapsulated in the component. And you'll even have a function called setState that sits inside your component, okay? And then it will set the state only for that component.
Okay, now should we ask the question, which components should have state? Is it all of them, or?
Right, so there are some components that actually don't really do much, right?
Okay.
They might just render something, right? So an example is the inbox item, right? It makes no sense why that inbox item should have any state at all. It should actually just be a very pure component that just does a render. And in fact, it should actually receive all of its data or its the stuff that it is going to render through the props mechanism instead of the state in the React components. Generally, components that do manipulate some data, obviously you want that data in the state. Components that do basically nothing besides render itself should probably not. You should not be calling setState inside that function, inside that component. You should actually just be using the props. And that's pretty much what the components that should have state and should not have state.
Okay. Why don't you tell us about the concepts of data flow and data binding as they pertain to React?
You're right. So in React, you'll notice that if we take a look at the diagram, the data flows in an interesting way. So you might have some central store. So in the case of our sample app, it's going to be basically the sample data.js file that's just going to contain an object that has all of the data. So like a representation of our database, essentially.
Kind of like a mock database, yeah.
Exactly. And it's all going to be hosted in memory. And the way that the data will flow in React is it'll actually flow in one direction only. All right. And basically, when we call render with props, all right. So when we pass in properties to a component, like or data through the props mechanism to a component, the component can choose to then pass other parts of this data as well to other components in its children, like its children components, and essentially, like the data will only flow one way down, so from the parent to the child through the props mechanism, and then every single component along this chain can have its own encapsulated state as well. And that's really what we're trying to highlight here, is that data flow in React tends to be very one-directional. All right, it's a bit different than other frameworks that have two-way data flows. All right. And this is going to lead to interesting challenges in React that are covered once your application gets a lot more complex. So this is where things like Redux will come in and the Flux architecture will come in. But for now, you just need to remember that data does flow in one direction, but we can have data get bubbled back up as well through events and messages and callbacks.
So I feel like the question that begs is, what happens then when I have a text box somewhere in my application and I enter a value and I click submit? Doesn't that require that I go up the tree, or what's the other mechanism for taking that value that the user has entered and submitting it?
Right. So instead of going backwards, like going up the tree to sort of pass that data back down again, what to other components that might be interested in that,
right.
What you said you're going to do is you're actually just going to send it back to the central store.
So you bypass the tree, go right back to the store, and then everything flows down again.
Exactly. So instead of going backwards, you just keep going in one direction.
And if we didn't have this gigantic performance gain that we get from maintaining a virtual DOM, this would be impossible. It's likely why it hasn't been done in the past.
Right.
But now we can afford to go back and change one little value in our global state and push everything down the tree again.
Exactly. And that is something that's possible only in React, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, next we're going to be looking more at properties, the properties that come in as data for our components, but that's just a glance at how your components need to deal with their state. And in the next video, we're going to talk about the difference between state and properties and what the consideration, when you should use one versus the other.
Yeah, and you'll see us actually use the props to pass data from one component to the next.
Excellent. Hey everybody, welcome back. We're talking about data right now in React.js. We looked at state, and we are going to get to properties here soon, but let's take a look at our data model, just kind of the mock data that we're using as the state for this application.
Yeah, so let's take a look at it. We're going to dive into the Part-1 folder of our React MVA Module 3 repo. So if you go into that folder, you'll notice that there is a new file in the app piece right here, and it's called sample-data.js. If I take a look at this, this is basically our mock data, and this is all of the state for our entire application.
Just a big,
right, so
just a big,
big
I guess
giant
it's not
object.
Technically JSON, it's actually object initializer syntax in JavaScript, but
yeah. So if I take a look at this, I've got this one sort of key at the top that's called humans, and then maybe we might want to add another one a little later. So if you remember, we're building our conversation pizza ordering bot. And obviously, this bot is going to talk to a bunch of different humans who are going to order some pizza, right? So I thought it would be interesting to sort things by the human that you're talking to. So you can see their prior conversations. You can see all the orders that they've placed. So you can see that all from the Pizza Bot Manager application, this sample app that we're building. So to take a look at it, what I've done here is I've actually set a object inside the humans object that has as the key the name of the human that you were talking to. And you'll notice that Visual Studio Code does this really nice thing of sort of creating the schema of our object for me. So you'll notice inside this, like the Rami Sayara object, this human object, I have two objects that are basically arrays, all the conversations essentially, and this is going to be an array of essentially an object that has who was speaking, whether it was the bot or the human, the message that they wrote, and the time that this message was sent. And for our orders array, we have essentially all the orders that were placed. So the time of the order, the pizzas that were ordered, so what toppings did they have, the different size that they had, and this is the pizzas is also an array as well, so you can have multiple pizzas that were ordered with different toppings and different sizes. The price of the order, the address, so where this order is being delivered to, and the status. And the status will be a couple of things, like whether it was open, so this is a new open order, if it's been confirmed, if the order is in the oven, or if it's being delivered right now. So this is the status that you'll see on the store pane in our completed app. The different numbers, it says how many are in confirmed or in the oven or delivered. And essentially, this is what our sample data looks like. We've got two humans in here. We've got me and my partner, Jeremy Foster, right here. And then we have different conversations for each of us and different orders as well.
And I see you gave me the cheese pizza. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I am a big meat lovers pizza lover, I guess. And I've got a small meat lovers pizza right there.
Now, Rami, can you talk about, we have the app component and these components below it. Do we load this state, this data, into our state one time at the top level, or do we load different pieces of this state at the different component level?
So there's different approaches that you can take. Our first approach in this app right now is to load the entire humans state into our app component, and then pass down pieces of this state
to the children.
Yeah, to the children using the props mechanism.
Okay.
But of course, other React developers take a different approach and sort of if a component is very independent and there's no one else that's going to be using that piece of the database, what they'll do is they'll have that component load up the data either through a REST API call or using some of the data libraries like Relay or Falcor themselves. So like it'll actually keep the component even more encapsulated, and it won't depend on any other parents or any other component to get data from it.
Excellent.
So in our case, though, what we'll do is we'll actually load up this entire state object into the app component and pass pieces to our other components, depending on what they actually need.
Okay. Anything else you want to add on the data model?
That's pretty much it. You'll actually see us add a stores as well. So instead of just having humans, we'll have another one for stores, and that's going to contain all the stores, where they are located, and what orders are currently attached to that pizza store that's making that pizza for you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And if you caught the last video, you saw how we were taking this data model, loading that into state, and next we're going to be talking about the properties, or as React calls them, the props.
The props. So we're going to load up the state from this sample.data.js file and pass it down to different components using the props.
All right. All right, back to React.js. More talk about data. Now, instead of talking about state, we're talking about props. How is that different? When do we use one? When do we use the other, Remy?
So state is basically the state of your component. Props are things that are passed to your component. So it would be different types of data.
Okay.
So in our example, we're going to be passing, we're going to have the main state of our application in the app component, and we're going to be passing pieces of that state to our children components using the props.
All right.
So let's get right to it. So on my screen, you'll see basically the starting point of module 3. So that's the start folder. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, instead of typing down all of the data, I'm actually going to copy it from the end result here. So if I go back to my folder, you'll notice that I'm in the start folder. Part 1 is what's going to be the result after all of this coding that we're doing in this video. So instead of typing out all of the data, I'm actually just going to copy it from my end result and actually add it directly to our app right here. So if I go back to Visual Studio Code, I've got my data. It's already
Thanks for not
in the
typing.
folder. Yeah, because it is quite repetitive and not particularly useful to learn. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get this data, and then you'll notice that this is just a simple JavaScript file that exports an object, so I can just simply require it into my app. So I'm going to do that by going var samples equal require, and you'll notice that I'm using the / here because this is a local file, and I'm just going to require it this way. So now I've got my samples in here, and if you remember our component lifecycle methods, methods and functions, you'll remember that there was one called getInitialState.
Yeah.
And what that does is it tells the app like what the initial state is. So we're going to add it, and we're just going to make it an empty state object, but at least it contains the structure of our state object. So that way, if we don't load the sample data, the props that are the state that we're gonna use to pass to the other components, at least there's like it's not a null value, it's just an empty object, right? Yeah. So I'm gonna return this object right here. You'll notice that it has humans, very similar to our sample data that we covered in the previous video, but also the stores that we might want to have as well, and that is essentially our get initial state. The next thing I want to do is I actually want to add a button that tells the React app to load the sample data. I'm just doing this for fun and just to show you how to do events and to do some of these things that we covered earlier, specifically because it's useful to do this. So here I'm going to create a button that calls a function called load sample data. Okay, give it our end component right here, and then I'm going to actually create a function called load sample data. Now you'll notice that I didn't need to bind the dis anywhere, because this is in React with the create class. Everything is auto bound to the instance of the component. So I didn't need to specify anything to actually make this work. I just go dis.loadSampleData, and it knows to refer to this function right away. So I'm going to add this function right here. And what this function is going to do is it's going to set the state of the application. And to do that, I'm going to go this.set state, and I'm just going to take the samples object right away. All right, so when that's done, if I press save, the Webpack is going to actually compile and tell me that my bundle is valid. So it is ready to go. There's no mistakes in my code. The next thing I want to do actually is sort of take a piece of this sample, okay, and actually pass it to my inbox. So if you remember in our data, humans is the container object that has the conversations.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to pass the conversations to my inbox pane so that we actually can show some things right over there. So to do that, I'm gonna go back into my app.js here, and I want to pass humans, okay, to this.state.humans. So this is a prop, okay. This is a property, all right, of the inbox pane. This is going to be available, and there's something that we added here that we should not have added, right there. You see the IntelliSense is really helpful. So we're passing this humans, okay, that's going to be available as part of the props to inbox pane. And this is going to take a piece of the state, not the entire state, not both humans and stores, just the humans piece. And we're going to pass this to the inbox pane for the reason that we want to show all of the conversations in the inbox. So for every single human that has ever interacted with our bot, we want to show at least a row that says, hey, this person has a message in your inbox, right? And of course, we can do something like sort it by order of when the last message was received and stuff like that, so that the stuff that's at the top of the inbox will be the most recent messages, recent chat conversation that you've had with that specific human. So to do this, here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. You'll notice here that I just have one inbox item, but actually, because there could be more than one human, right, I'm going to want to create an inbox item for every single one of those humans. Right. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just write JavaScript code into the body of, into the T body right away. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go object.keys, this.props, okay, human, with an S. So what this is going to do is going to get all the keys in the humans object, okay? And then I'm going to map this to another function called render inbox item, okay? So if I do that, it's going to take the prop, when it renders the function, it's going to take all the humans that were passed as part of the props, okay? And then for every single key in this humans object, it will map it to this function. So it will apply render inbox item.
Now that function, render inbox item, is one that React gives us because we have a component called inbox item. Is that right?
No, that's not it. We're actually going to create that function ourselves.
Oh, okay.
And then we're going to return the inbox item from that function.
Okay, excellent.
Right. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to create this function called render inbox item. Okay. And because the objects.key and we're mapping to this array of keys, it means that for every single call of the map function, we're going to get a key, okay? Or in this case, we can call the key the specific human, all right? And then we're going to create this function. And you'll notice here that I'm going to return an inbox item. Now you notice that I have JSX that's not in my render function, and that's totally okay, because the transpiler is actually going to convert that into the underlying React function calls.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create inbox item, and let's say I want to pass the details of this conversation. So I'm going to go details this.props.humans, the specific human that I'm mapping to, this one right here. And what I'm going to do at the end is close this off, and this will now add an inbox item for every human key that gets passed every time the render inbox item gets passed. Now, there's a couple of things that we need to add here to actually make this work with React. Now, because we're creating a bunch of inbox items under the same sort of T body right here, React is not going to know how to reference every single component unless we tell it that we give it a key to use for that item. And what better key to use than the actual human name as well? So I can actually type in key, and this is something that's very specific to React. Okay, like this key feature is really important, especially when you have lists of items.
Yeah.
You should give it a key. So here I'm going to use the human name as the key because there's all my entire samples database will. I am guaranteeing that on that side